is the second year in a row that Gay roped me into giving this sermon for Veterans Day. So I had to come up with something a little different than we talked about last year. I hope you've noticed a theme in our worship this morning of gratitude, of service, and making decisions about how to serve. On Veterans Day, we thank our veterans and we reflect on their service. It's easy to become very cliched when we do that, and thinking about that can slide into a kind of nationalism. But I hope some of the context we've been considering helps us think about service to nation in a way that goes beyond cliches, one that speaks of all kinds of service, military and otherwise, as expression of values, as expression of our service to people, not flags, not songs, but to people. And so to help us reflect on that, I thought of the story of Noor Inayat Khan, who was a prolific children's writer of the 1930s. And in fact, was the author of the fable that we just heard today. She was also a uniformed hero of the Second World War, posthumously receiving both the Croix de Guerre of France and the St. George's Cross of England, the highest military honors of both of those countries, respectively. Her death and her honors came after many difficult decisions made under challenging circumstances as to how best to serve in accordance with her values. So Noor Inayat's father was a mystic teacher and musician, Hazrat Inayat Khan. He left his native India many years before to introduce the West to Sufi mysticism, Sufi being a form of Islam, with a particular focus on the mystical and peace-bringing powers of music. Hazrat Inayat had met her mother, Ora Ray Baker, an American, in the United States. He was very successful in the United States in terms of teaching, but racial prejudice put up a boundary to their marriage, and their engagement forced them to elope and flee to Russia, where Noor was born in 1914. They then resettled in the United Kingdom, where once again they found a great deal of racial prejudice against their marriage, and finally resettled in France in a more diverse atmosphere where Noor grew up. It was here that Hazrat Inayat founded a practice of what he called universal worship. His philosophy taught the brotherhood of all people, the wisdom that could be found in all religions and philosophy, and stressed the themes of nonviolence and self-sacrifice for others. His death in 1927 forced his children to take new responsibilities in their families, taking on jobs, studying with an eye to professions in music, religion, and storytelling. Noor Inayat took a bachelor's degree in child psychology from the Sorbonne, continued her music studies, and began writing for a living. She wrote stories and poems for publication and radio broadcast. By 1938, she'd made a good name for herself in the world of children's literature, writing in both French and English, publishing books, and writing poems for the radio. So how does this pacifist and children's author, as you can see her on the left, she's playing some of her father's music. How does she come to receive the highest military honor of not one but two nations? And how did the great-great-granddaughter of the Tipu Sultan, one of the most fierce defenders of India against British rule, who died fighting the British in 1799, how did she come to put on the military uniform of the United Kingdom? That begins with the Nazi conquest of France. Noor had volunteered with the Red Cross under the looming threat of German invasion in 1939, training as a nurse to aid others in wartime. But the frightening advance of German armies in June 1940 led her family to flee with the last boats of British civilian refugees. Her brother Viliat had been born in the UK, and that accident kept them ahead of Nazi rule. With the war underway, living in Britain, both Noor and her younger brother were of an age and felt a call to serve. And they initially became involved in British Red Cross work and other relief efforts. At first, neither wished to seek out military service. As I mentioned, they have little particular love for the United Kingdom, but more importantly, the philosophy they shared emphasized service and sacrifice, but also stressed the universal connections of humanity and called for nonviolence. Now, there was certainly a place in the war for pacifists to join the effort. Many conscientious objectors sought out relief, humanitarian, or medical work, while British draft boards assigned draftable conscientious objectors to work in factories or mines, in the Royal Army Medical Corps, or to the non-combatant corps, where they joined draftees physically unable to fight, and working for transport services and doing other kinds of support roles. Some of these were extremely dangerous, by the way. Fighting fires from incendiary bombs was not an easy job. And many members of the NCC, the non-combatant corps, also took roles in disposing of unexploded bombs, which was often quite a fatal task. So it's not that to choose such a path would mean a lack of courage. But Noor and Vilayat felt it necessary to take on further roles in support of war. Both felt a duty to the people of two nations in particular, both India and France. Dedicated to Indian independence, both came to agree that the visible, uniformed service of Indians might help sway British opinion towards post-war independence for India. Much as African American service members in the US would later hope that their visible service would push forward the cause of civil rights, as those of you who were here last year for my sermon may remember that discussion. But as children who'd grown up in France, their concern was also for neighbors and friends and communities. The horrors of German occupation, while reported in fragments, pressed heavily in their minds. In France, their mixed-race family, members of a religious minority, had found some acceptance and community. They'd found freedom not available in either the US or the UK for their parents. For them, the French revolutionary motto of liberté, égalité, fraternité were not just words, but to some extent a reflection of their experience in France, where they were treated with equality and found the liberty, the freedom to pursue their father's dream of the universal fraternity of humanity. Anything to speed liberation seemed to be the right decision. As Vilayat Khan explained much later after the war, we came to see that if a person came to your house who wanted to kill 20 people in the house, that perhaps the right choice in that moment would not be to remain nonviolent, but to defend the people in your house, however you needed to. This was a difficult decision in an impossible time, forcing them to truly discern how their sometimes conflicting values were leading them. In the end, they both joined branches of the military. Vilayat joined the Royal Navy, where he worked on a minesweeper. That's a ship that identifies and destroys the mines that were planted to take down Allied shipping. This was also not a particularly safe job, but then the family philosophy did not emphasize being safe, but rather taking on the sacrifices to serve one's community. As for Noor, she joined the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, or WAFs, in November 1940. Her training as a musician left her with a keen ear and very nimble fingers, so she was selected to become a radio operator. And she was so successful at this, she applied for a commission and more advanced work in signals training. And this is where her story takes an interesting twist. In 1942, she received a summons from the War Office to meet with a Captain Jepson. Now, without giving her too many details, he explained that radio operators were desperately needed for secret military operations in France itself, where they would relay messages between London and resistance groups. As a fluent French speaker and former resident with radio skills, she would be a natural. But he also was quite honest with her about the risk of capture by the Gestapo, the brutal Nazi secret police who were known to torture and kill prisoners of all stripes, but especially spies. Faced with the opportunity to aid the people of France directly, to stand between them and the men who'd come to kill them, Noor accepted the offer, not even knowing the name of the agency she was to work for. It was in fact the Special Operations Executive, or SOE, a secret military intelligence unit tasked with what Winston Churchill said was setting Europe ablaze. In operations all over the continent, SOE agents provided arms, explosives, and assistance to local resistance groups. The recruiting of women into this force had proven very controversial within intelligence circles. But the decision was that they were less likely to draw scrutiny as undercover agents, unlike healthy young men of military age wandering around without an excuse. Women might be less visible to Nazi occupiers. They were recruited primarily as radio operators, but might be called upon to serve as couriers, saboteurs, and spies. Nora was full of self-doubt, as her friends described later. She was not certain she could ever perform an act of violence. If it were to prove necessary during her mission. But she continued on with her training. She and all the other women joined the men in rigorous physical training that included close combat skills and the use of small arms, as well as skills in evasion and other techniques of spycraft. Her instructors were not always impressed with Nora. Her pacifist instincts and dreamy personality were derided in their reports as childlike, unstable, very feminine, and scared of weapons. One complained that she was, quote, not overburdened with brains. The commanding officer of the SOE, Morris Buckminster, rejected that report, writing on it, "I don't want them overburdened with brains." It was her skill as a radio operator, her facility with language and codes, and her courage that made her a valuable recruit. As her female supervising officer Vera Atkins observed, in these areas she was a natural. And so Nora parachuted into France in 1943, the first female radio operator to be deployed there. She successfully made contact with her operatives and began transmitting immediately after. Unfortunately, what neither she nor the London office knew was that this particular circuit had been horribly compromised. The safe house where she was staying was raided. Nora escaped with her radio housed in a clumsy suitcase and little else. Although she made contact with other intelligence agents, she had to be constantly on the move and wary. She was offered an opportunity to fly back to London, but she chose to stay, relaying a valuable intelligence about her observations of occupied Paris. As almost every other radio operator in the region was captured, Noor stayed a step ahead of the Gestapo, allowing her to transmit messages from many different agents, including a high-ranking SOE officer whose own operator was captured almost as soon as they parachuted into France. But soon, Noor had no safe houses left. She fell back on her circle of pre-war friends for shelter, really her only option. She moved around the city of Paris so as to escape detection, changing her appearance, bleaching her hair, trying not to be too obvious. The Gestapo were onto her activities, but they knew her only by her radio code name, Madeline, named for the famous children's book character. For over 4 months, she evaded capture. In the end, someone whom she trusted betrayed her, probably for a cash reward. Even then, she was not easy to capture. The woman, derided as scared of weapons, fought and bit and kicked so hard that the single Gestapo agent sent to apprehend her had to be assisted by 6 others. During her training, Noor had miserably failed a mock interrogation. Inculcated with values of openness and honesty, she found it hard to lie, even under pressure. But at Gestapo headquarters, records confirm that she gave away no secrets and offered no true intelligence. The Gestapo wireless expert Joseph Goetz later admitted that Madeline refused to give us any assistance whatsoever. And in a post-war statement, Hans Kiefer, the commandant, confirmed that they could, quote, never rely on anything she said. Perhaps now it was real. Or perhaps she wanted to do all she could to hinder the German mission, keeping lives safe. But I don't want us to think of her as some steely-eyed, tough cartoon heroine, because I think that does a disservice to her humanity. We know from her fellow prisoners' testimony that she was scared. At night, she cried in her cell. She composed children's stories to distract and calm herself, and in the daytime, she returned to defying her captors once more. She made 2 unsuccessful escape attempts. After the second one, the Gestapo demanded that she pledge to never attempt escape again. And she refused, even knowing that would bring her dire consequences. She was assigned to become a Nacht und Nebel prisoner, night and fog, so designated as to vanish into the German prison camp network. Only thanks to years of post-war searching do we know what happened to her. For 10 months, she was imprisoned under dreadful conditions, chained hand and foot in a cold cell, receiving the lowest form of rations, kept in solitary confinement and subject to frequent beatings. She communicated with other female prisoners by carving messages onto a meal bowl and tapping in Morse code on the walls of her cell. In September of 1944, she was abruptly moved to the notorious camp at Buchenwald, where with 3 other captured female agents from the SOE, women that she had ironically trained with, she was executed. Eyewitness reports suggest she was singled out for brutal treatment before the end, perhaps due to her status as a mixed-race woman, and perhaps due to her reputation as a dangerous, obdurate prisoner. Those same witnesses also suggest that the last audible word she spoke was simply liberté, freedom. Whether or not that report is accurate, it's certainly true that the love of freedom was one of the values Noor was true to until her very end. Not her own freedom. She sacrificed that in hope that others, especially her beloved religious community and friends, might have freedom from oppression once more. Living in the impossible times she did, she made difficult decisions. Should she put her nonviolence first and hope to bring peace by example? Or should she choose a path that might necessitate violence and untruth in order to more directly defeat a greater evil, the evil of Nazism? Although most of us don't face the same situations Noor did, and I hope we don't have to, we all face choices that force us to choose between different values we may hold dear. This being election season, I've certainly heard plenty of grumbling about less than ideal candidates. From people struggling whether to cast a vote for a candidate that reflects their values pretty well, or one that reflects some of their values but has a better chance of winning. And I think I've heard the term choosing the lesser evil a time or two. It can be very dissatisfying. But in a time of rising white supremacy, of authoritarianism, of very real threats to the rights of women and LGBTQ folk. I think it's fair to say that many of us are contemplating the greater evil these days and what it might mean in our day and age. And it's scary. And perhaps that provokes us to ask difficult questions about how we can best serve our country now, and how we can serve the people of the country and the world. As you use, we have 7 principles to which we hold true. How can we best preserve justice, equity, and compassion? How should we fight for the inherent worth and dignity of every person? How shall we exercise our right of conscience? And the last word of Noor Inayat Khan is also amongst our values: liberté, in the form of a goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. What would we do for that? What should we do for that? We are not living in quite as impossible times as Noor did, but we certainly live in a time when many of the same forces, the militarism, the murderous racial hatred, the denial of democracy, are on the march. Sometimes even under that same swastika that stalked her and so many others. And we, like she did, have to make choices to make about our service, whether it's in uniform, as with the veterans we honored today, or out of it. Whether as healers or defenders, as protesters or legislators, as peacemakers, or as the organizer for righteous anger. We need now to seek clarity about our roles. The words of our closing hymn speak to this, to weighing our reason and compassion, our interconnectedness, and our ministry. Perhaps verse 4 speaks most to me, as it speaks of waking the conscience with justice as guide, and joining with people whose rights are denied. May we all have that discernment to find our own paths to service in accordance with our conscience and our values. Amen, and blessed be.